I am Sailaja, Assistant Professor cum Neuroscience Technologist from Department of Neuroscience Technology at Yenepoya School of Allied Health Science. Today we are going to discuss about the topic cerebellum. On specific learning objectives, by the end of this session, student will be able to explain the structure and functions of cerebellum, to describe the afferent and efferent connections of the cerebellum within the CNS. In our cranium, we have three cranial fossa, that is anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa. Our cerebellum is situated in the posterior cranial fossa and is covered superiorly by the tentorium cerebelli. Cerebellum is the largest part of a hindbrain and lies posterior to the fourth ventricle, the pons and the medulla oblongata. On this picture, you can see how our cerebellum is placed in our brain, which is posterior to our fourth ventricle, pons and medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is somewhat ovoid in shape and constricted in the median part. It consists of two cerebral hemispheres joined by narrow median vermis. Cerebellum is connected to the posterior aspect of the brainstem by three symmetrical bundles of nerve fiber called peduncle. Our cerebellum is connected to midbrain through superior peduncle, and it's connected to the pons by the middle peduncle, and is connected to the medulla oblongata through our inferior peduncles. Let's discuss about the external features of our cerebellum. Cerebellum consists of two cerebral hemispheres, one median vermis and two surfaces, that is superior and inferior surfaces. On each cerebral hemisphere, we consist of three lobes, that is anterior lobe, middle lobe and flocculonodular lobe, which is divided by three fissures, that is primary fissure, horizontal fissure and vulvonodular fissure. Anterior lobe is the most superior part of the lobe, which is separated from the middle lobe by our primary fissure. Middle lobe is the largest part in our cerebellum, which is present between our anterior lobe and flocculonodular lobe. The horizontal fissure, which is a V-shaped fissure, which is present in the middle lobe, which has no anatomical and physiological significance. The flocculonodular lobe is the third most lobe, which is present superior to the posterior to the vulvonodular fissure. We can divide our cerebellum into outer grey matter and inner white matter. In our grey matter, we consist of three layers, that is molecular layer, Purkinje layer and granular layer. In white matter, we consist of intrinsic fibers, efferent fibers and efferent fibers. Molecular layer is the topmost layer in our cerebral cortex, which consists of outer stellate cells, which is represented in a green color, and an inner basket cell, which is represented in a blue color. The second layer is the Purkinje layer, which consists of a flask-shaped Purkinje cells arranged in a single layer, and their dendrites passes to the molecular layer and their axons passes to our white matter through the granular layer to synapse with our intercerebellar nuclei. The granular layer is the third most layer, which consists of the Golgi cells and packed with small granular cells, which is represented in a red color. These granular cells these axons will give rise to our molecular layer, that they will bifurcate into T shape, which is parallel to our folia. Inside the white matter, we have four masses of grey matter embedded in the white matter, that we call it as an intercerebellar nuclei. From the lateral to the medial, we have dentate nucleus, emboliform nucleus, globus nucleus and vestigial nucleus. To remember this, there is a mnemonic, that is don't eat greasy food, that is D for dentate, E for emboliform, G for globus, F for vestigial. Let's discuss about the white matter of cerebellum. White matter resembles the trunk and branches of a tree, and thus is termed as the arbor vitae. The white matter is made up of three groups of fibers, that is intrinsic fibers, efferent fibers and efferent fibers. Intrinsic fibers do not leave the cerebellum but connect different regions of an organ. Some interconnect folia of the cerebellar cortex and vermis on the same side, others connect the two cerebellar hemispheres together. The efferent fibers, from the name itself you can understand it is a sensory fibers, forms the greater part of the white matter and proceed to the cerebellar cortex. They enter the cerebellum mainly through the inferior and middle cerebellar peduncles. The efferent fibers. The efferent fibers is a motor fiber constitute the output of the cerebellum. The great majority of the Purkinje cell axon passes to and synapses with the neurons of the cerebellum nuclei. The axons of the neurons then leave the cerebellum through our dentate emboliform globus nuclei and leave the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. The fibers from the vestigial nucleus leave through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Let's discuss about the connections of cerebellum. In our cerebellum, we consist of afferent cerebellar pathway and efferent cerebellar pathway. The corticopontocerebellar, cerebro-olivocerebellar and cerebro-reticulocerebellar, these three arises from our cerebral cortex and gives information to the cerebellum. The anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar and cunocerebellar arises from our brain stem and gives information to our cerebellum. Now let's discuss about each and every pathway in detail. Corticopontocerebellar pathway. These fibers arises from our cerebral cortex and passes through the corona radiata and internal capsule and terminate in the pontine nucleus which is present in the pons and terminate in the cerebellum through our middle cerebral peduncle. Cerebro-reticular pathway, which are these fibers arises from our cerebral cortex which passes from corona radiata and internal capsule and terminate in the reticular nucleus in the pons and terminate in the cerebellum through our inferior and middle cerebellar peduncle. The third is cerebro-olivocerebellar pathway. This pathway arises from our cerebral cortex and passes through the internal capsule and corona radiata and terminate in the inferior olivary nucleus which is present in the medulla oblongata and passes to the cerebellum by the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The anterior spinocerebellar pathway. These fibers arises from the posterior root ganglion and terminate in the grey matter of the spinal cord. These fibers arises from there and ascends to the inferior cerebellar peduncle and bypass to the cerebellum by our inferior cerebellar peduncle. The second is posterior spinocerebellar pathway. These fibers arises from our spinal cord and terminate in the cerebellum through our inferior cerebellar peduncle. The cunocerebellar pathway. These fibers arises from our cunate nucleus from medulla oblongata and enter into the cerebellum through inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now let's discuss about the efferent cerebellar pathway. We have four types of pathway, that is globus emboliform rubral pathway, dentothalamic pathway, vestigial vestibular pathway, vestigial reticular pathway. Globus emboliform rubral pathway. These fibers arises from the intercerebellar nuclei, that is globus and emboliform, and terminate in the red nucleus through our inferior cerebellar peduncle. The dentothalamic pathway. These fibers arises from the dentate nucleus from the cerebellum and passes to the thalamus and to the cerebellar cortex. Vestigial reticular pathway. These fibers arises from the vestigial nucleus and terminate in the reticular nucleus through our inferior cerebellar peduncle. These are the following functions of our cerebellum, that is motor control and coordination, balance and postural stability, motor learning, cognitive functions, regulations of eye movement, muscle tone regulation, error detection and feedback. To summarize, gross appearance, cerebellum situated in the posterior cranial fossa and posterior to the pons and medulla oblongata. The external feature consists of 3 lobes and 3 fissures and 1 vermis. Divisions of cerebellum. The cerebellum consists of outer grey matter and inner white matter and its nuclei. The white matter consists of intrinsic, afferent and efferent fibers. The cerebellum has efferent and afferent pathway from the spinal cord as well as from the cortex, which passes from and to the cerebellum through cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellum has 3 peduncles, superior, inferior and middle peduncles. These are my references. Thank you.